Okay guys, we're going to go ahead and start the next body system, which is the nervous system. We're going to begin with the peripheral nervous system. There's two parts of the nervous system. This is where we're going to go first, is the peripheral. But let's mention first what the function of the nervous system is. One is sensory input, which basically means that's the information that is gathered by sensory receptors. And that could come from sight, that could come from smell, that could come from lots of different things. So the information gathered by sensory receptors, that makes sense. That's where the senses go in. So integration pretty much means that's how your body interprets it. So the body interpretation of that sensory input. Okay? And then the motor output just means it's activated. So the activation to produce a response. So your body actually does something about that sensory input. So the endocrine, this is a part of it in the endocrine system I think we'll study next, but the integrin and the nervous systems, they are who controls and communicate sort of impulses throughout the body. So to kind of give you an idea of a picture of what this would look like is the person here, they see water, it goes down, the brain inputs that, and then the actual motor reflex would be drinking the water. So there's two parts, or what they call subdivisions of the nervous system. One is the central nervous system, and what it is, two parts of that one. The brain and the spinal cord. Those are the two parts. And then what they call enclosed in-body coverings. But again, I'll get to the central nervous system later. We're going to focus on the peripheral nervous system in this part. Except what I just mentioned. Okay. The first part are the cranial, the cranial and spinal nerves. Okay, so that's one part. And then what they call ganglia, which are swellings of cell bodies inside of that nerve, and we'll get to that in a second. So those are the two parts, the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system, and we'll focus on the PNS right now. So how cells actually communicate with each other, that is through a neuron. Cell. Okay, there's a bunch. Okay, so when you were born, there were about 100 billion when you were born. And they're all connected together, and that is what we're going to call the body's information transportation system. So how information is transported throughout the body. Okay, so let's kind of focus in on this picture. So here's a neuron. It's sending information, and let's see if there's a better picture coming up. Actually, there is a better picture coming up, so I'll get to that in a second. So neurons, so there's the parts that you're going to need to know. I'll just list them here, and then we will go into them in the next picture. The cell body, the dendrite, the axon, and the synapse. On terminal, because that's where it ends. So that's the synapse. Okay, so those are the parts. So let's go into what those mean. The cell body of the neuron, and that's where the nucleus is. And so when they say it houses the nucleus, all that means is that's where the nucleus is. Okay, and the dendrite, those are fibers that actually get information. So they receive the information and they send it to the cell body. Okay, so you got the cell body and the dendrite that actually receives the information and they send it to the cell body. And then the axon is this actual signal that's sent through the body. And so kind of get a bigger picture here. All right, so what we're focusing in on here, these guys right here are the dendrites. So those are the receptive regions. That's what's actually getting the information. And they look like trees. Prefix dendro, like dendrology, that's the study of trees. Anyway, that's how it got its name. Those are the dendrites. That's what receives the information. Here you see a nucleus, so you know that's the cell body. Okay, and this right here is the nucleus. And we're not going to worry about that part right there. Here is the axon. So those are the impulse generating and conducting regions. So that's what's generating sort of the idea and sending along the information. So the impulse direction, we're moving this direction. Right here is what's called the Schwann cells. And then these are called the node, or it's one of them is the node of Ranvier, but I don't think we're going to actually mention these two too much, so I don't know, I kind of want to cross them out right now, but maybe I won't. So the big important thing here is the axon. So that's where sometimes they say it secretes, so it gets rid of that information. So this is the information path. The dendrites receive it. Here's the cell body. The axon is going to send the impulse in this direction, and so it's leaving the secreting here, and then it'll again, there's going to be another dendrite along that will again receive the information and then send it back along that way. So it's a mode of transportation. Okay, so the myelin sheath, I'll just a nerve impulse would be sent. So it increases the speed of nerve impulse. How fast do we get sent? And degeneration, you may have heard of MS or multiple sclerosis. So a degeneration in that myelin sheath or in that insulation could cause multiple sclerosis. And the Schwann cells, those are layers of the myelin sheath, but actually I'm not going to ask you about those. And then the nodes of Ranvier, that's in between the Schwann cells, so I'm not going to actually ask you about those either. So let's go ahead, and I think this is pretty interesting. So if you think about it in terms of what is faster, because the whole thought process is very fast, but which do you think is faster, thought or electricity? So it depends, but neuronal speed is about 200 to 200 miles per hour, which is crazy fast. But then electricity is about 600 million miles per hour, so electricity wins, but still neuronal speed is pretty darn fast. So that's why it takes a person a second, even a second or two, to react. When you see something like a child runs out in front of a car, there is a brief moment of seeing it happening before you can actually react to that. So the nervous system, there's 3 types of neurons. One is sensory, and it sends information from the body's tissues to the brain. Okay, so it senses something and then it sends that information to the body. To the brain. And then the motor neurons are what actually get that information, so they send information from the brain to the body to do something. And the interneurons are those things that would be in between the sensory and motor. Okay, so sensory, think you touch something, Motor says, ouch, that's hot. I need to pull my finger or my hand away from that, whatever's hot. And the interneurons are in between that sensory and motor input. And you may have heard the term Mad Hatter, especially from Alice in Wonderland. Just a side note here. It's Mad Hatter is caused by dimethylmercury, and it's a super toxin that actually, we're going to call it, clings to or holds on to and destroys neurons. So the things that would cause you to move or not move, get information or not get information. The way that they, one recent example is a few years back, it was about 1996. A professor at Dartmouth College spilled mercury onto her glove, and by about 6 months later, she started feeling tingles. Then she started to have poor balance, she slurred her speech, and then she couldn't see. So by the end of 97, so about a year later, they saw that she had mercury poisoning, and she was no longer responding to light, sound, or touch, and she died shortly after. So within about a year of being exposed to mercury, she died of mercury poisoning. So what this all has to do with Mad Hatter is that it was an occupational hazard. In about the 19th century, so like the 1800s, people who made hats, that was used, dimethylmercury, to make hats shiny. So people who, that was their profession, being mad or being crazy, kind of came along with that. But anyway, it just kind of comes down to, if you destroy those neurons, you will eventually, when they say mad, they lost their ability to do a lot of things. Okay, so how those neurons actually communicate with each other. It's called an axon terminal, and I see the word terminal. I think of like a bus terminal, where things would meet up, and so it meets those things that looked like trees, and moving on. So the synapse is the space between their neurons. Okay, so it's in between. The neurotransmitters cross that gap and bind to receptor sites, so where they're going to get the information on the receiving dendrite. Okay, so impulses are only going to go. So you have those trees, you have the dendrites, they go to the cell body, and then they go to the axon, and then they'll again go back to the dendrite, cell body, axon, but only in one direction. And just kind of a side note here is that most signals, what they call is excitatory, and some are what they call inhibitory. Okay. So certain drugs can affect how impulses are sent. So caffeine is an example of, you would probably guess, excitatory. And aspirin and other illegal drugs, but they would be inhibitory. They would slow down how fast those signals are sent. I'm going to mention these real quickly, and then we're going to, I'll stop there for today, or for right now. Just what these neurotransmitters are called, and then we'll get into them for the next lecture. So the first one is called acetylcholine. The next one, dopamine. Then serotonin, norepinephrine, and then GABA is what they call it, but gamma aminobutyric acid, and then glutamate. So those are the ones that you're going to need to be familiar with. Some examples, what they do, and what happens when you don't have them or they're not being processed. But that'll be in the next lecture. So I'll go ahead and stop there, and then we'll continue later.